The day I became the most hated man in Lakeside Estates started like any other, with a quiet, cloudy morning, and ended with a $500 fine that flipped my world upside down and ultimately gave me all the motivation I needed to turn this HOA-run fantasy land into my own battleground. I wasn't looking for a fight when I bought the house on Sycamore Drive. In fact, I was running from one. After my wife Rachel passed away from cancer, my daughter Solon and I were broken. Grief hung around the house like thick fog, and everything reminded us of what we lost. Fishing had always been our family's peaceful escape, the one thing that calmed Rachel during her final months and kept Solon connected to the parts of her mum that didn't hurt to remember. That's why I chose Lakeside Estates. The homes were beautiful, yes. The schools were good, of course. But it was the lake. 6 calm acres of clear, glistening water in the middle of the neighborhood that sealed the deal. The realtor even said it was a key community feature, perfect for weekend relaxation. And I pictured Solon and me slowly rebuilding our lives by that very water. We moved in quietly, kept to ourselves, and slowly started to breathe again. That Saturday morning, we packed up our gear and headed down to the small wooden dock by the lake. Solon's laughter, after she caught her second fish, was the first real sound of joy I'd heard from her in months. And then, like a villain scripted straight out of a bad movie, came Karen Wellington. She walked up, stiff as a board, perfectly styled hair, expensive yoga outfit, and a scowl sharp enough to cut glass. Her voice, shrill and full of unearned authority, cut through the calm like a siren. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" I turned with a polite smile, confused at the hostility. "Just fishing with my daughter," I replied. "We moved in recently. I'm Remy Thorncraft." I extended my hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she shoved a tablet in my face with an official-looking PDF. "I'm Karen Wellington, HOA president. Fishing is prohibited on this lake. This is a $500 violation." Just like that. No warning. No kindness. Just a fine. My daughter froze beside me, confused and hurt. I tried explaining that we were told fishing was allowed, that it was one of the reasons we moved, that it was helping my daughter cope. Karen didn't budge. She smugly informed me that the rule had been updated just 4 weeks ago and emailed to all residents. I checked later. We never got that email. Not in spam, not in inbox, nowhere. And yet she stood there, arms crossed, face smug, completely unmoved by the fact she was taking away the only thing keeping my daughter sane. I asked why the rule had changed. She muttered something about protecting wildlife and residents complaining about fish smell, but the way she glanced at our tackle box and turned up her nose told me this had nothing to do with wildlife and everything to do with control. This wasn't about rules, it was about who she thought we were. Outsiders, new money, people who didn't fit her vision of this pristine neighborhood. I wanted to argue, I wanted to explode, but then I looked at Solon. Her eyes were full of tears, and her hands trembled as she packed up the fishing rod. So instead, I swallowed my pride. "Fine," I said. "Please send me the details." Karen's smug grin widened as she nodded. "Glad we understand each other." She strutted off like she'd won a trophy, but she had no idea she'd just started a war. That night, after I tucked Solon in, I sat at my computer and started reading. Everything I could find about Lakeside Estates HOA. I learned about Karen's 8-year reign as HOA president, her real estate business that specialized in high-end neighborhoods like this, her pattern of rewriting rules and silencing dissent, her personal parties by the lake, photos of wine glasses and music by the very water she claimed was too sacred for my daughter and me to fish in. The hypocrisy was infuriating, but the biggest revelation came from the documents buried in the HOA portal. I found an obscure clause that mentioned the lake wasn't even owned by the HOA. It belonged to the original developers and was leased to the HOA for a limited term. A few more clicks, and I saw the lease expired in less than 2 months. 2 months! And suddenly it hit me. Karen didn't own the lake. She was bluffing. Her entire reign was built on scare tactics and half-truths. If that lease went up for renewal, What if I got there first? What if I bought it out from under them? The next morning, while walking the dog, I ran into an older man named Merrick Henderson. Turned out he was a retired lawyer and long-time resident. I mentioned the incident. He shook his head and said, "She's been doing this for years. Most people just roll over, but you seem different." I told him what I found about the lease. His eyes lit up. "You know," he said, "that lease is the key. If you really want to push back, that's where you start." And just like that, the first seed of resistance was planted. I wasn't going to fight with yelling. I wasn't going to write angry emails. I was going to buy the lake. Because Karen didn't just mess with a grieving dad trying to bond with his daughter. She messed with a man who had time, money, and a very long memory. This was no longer just about a fine. It was about taking back peace. It was about standing up for what mattered. And it was only the beginning. That night, I couldn't shake the image of Karen's smug smile and the sound of my daughter sniffling beside me. It haunted me in a way I hadn't felt since the worst days in the hospital with Rachel. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I realized I wasn't just angry, I was awake in a way I hadn't been for a long time. Grief had dulled me, softened my edges, but now, thanks to one arrogant HOA president and a $500 fine for comforting my daughter with something as harmless as fishing, I was sharper than ever. And I wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. So I got out of bed, brewed a fresh cup of coffee, even though it was almost midnight, and sat down in front of my laptop, determined to learn exactly who I was dealing with and how deep this HOA nonsense went. And what I uncovered over the next 6 hours changed everything. Because as I dug through the Lakeside Estates, HOA's public filings, community newsletters, real estate documents, archived emails, I eventually sourced from a resident Facebook group, and even social media posts by Karen herself, a disturbing picture emerged. This wasn't just an overzealous rule enforcer. This was a woman who had spent the last 8 years tightening her grip on the neighborhood like a queen guarding a crumbling castle, changing regulations with vague email notices, pushing through amendments with barely any resident voting, fining homeowners for everything from mailboxes being the wrong shade of beige to having patio lights visible past 10 p.m, and ruling over everything like it was her personal gated kingdom. And worse, she did it all with the kind of arrogance only someone convinced of their untouchable status could manage. And the final straw for me was discovering a series of photos she herself had posted online. Karen, wine glass in hand, throwing elaborate lakeside parties with loud music, catered food, and what looked like more than a few local politicians in attendance, all while claiming to residents like me that community standards meant we couldn't quietly fish off a dock. And that's when I knew this wasn't about rules, this was about control. And something about that made the fire in my chest burn hotter than it had in months. And it was around 5 a.m. when I stumbled upon a name I hadn't heard before. Meridian Development Corporation, listed as the original owner of the land the lake sits on. And as I cross-referenced it with the HOA documents, I discovered something that made me sit up straight. The HOA didn't own the lake. Not now, not ever. They had been leasing it from Meridian for the past 30 years under a special use agreement. And the kicker? That lease was due to expire in less than 60 days, meaning that for all her bluster and fines and community culture nonsense, Karen didn't actually own the ground she stood on. She was bluffing with a ticking clock, and that revelation felt like the first real leverage I'd had in weeks. Because if Meridian was still the rightful owner, and if, just if, they were willing to sell or even renegotiate, that could change the entire power dynamic of Lakeside Estates overnight. And I needed more. So I did what I never thought I would and walked over to my neighbour's place around noon the next day, after catching a glimpse of him walking his golden retriever past my window. Merrick Henderson, the older gentleman who lived 3 doors down, always wearing a fishing cap and carrying himself with that calm, studied energy of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. And when I mentioned Karen's name, he chuckled, shook his head and said, "Ah, you've had your first run-in with the Queen," before inviting me in for coffee. and what turned out to be one of the most enlightening conversations I'd had since moving in. Because Merrick, as it turned out, was a retired civil litigation attorney who had once specialized in property law and community governance, and he knew every inch of HOA territory, every flaw in the system, and every legal grey area Karen had been exploiting for years. And after showing him the violation letter and explaining the fishing ban, Merrick pulled out a drawer full of old HOA newsletters, lease documents, meeting minutes, and correspondence with Meridian that made it clear just how precarious Karen's throne really was. And when he confirmed that the lease on the lake was indeed expiring, and that Meridian, according to some financial reports he had access to, was struggling to stay solvent after a failed expansion project, I felt the first true spark of possibility in my chest. Because what if I could buy the rights to the lake, or even a share in them? What if I could negotiate directly with Meridian and wrest control away from the HOA before Karen even knew what hit her? The more we talked, the more obvious it became. This was a chessboard, and Karen thought she had me in check. But she didn't realize I was about to flip the board entirely, and as Merrick and I pored over the documents, we found other cracks too. Conflicts of interest between Karen's real estate firm and the properties listed for sale under HOA-approved contractors. Inconsistent fine structures, depending on which street you lived on, and even evidence of Karen blocking residents she didn't like from joining HOA committees or attending open meetings under the excuse of private executive sessions, all of which pointed to a long-standing pattern of unchecked authority wrapped in bureaucracy. And now that I had Merrick on my side, I wasn't alone, and more than that, I had a plan forming. One that involved finding Meridian's current leadership, presenting them with a purchase proposal, and forcing Karen to reckon with a version of Lakeside Estates where she didn't get to make the rules anymore. Because this wasn't just about a $500 fine or a fishing pole, this was about every quiet injustice she'd gotten away with. Every new resident she'd intimidated, every grieving father she'd disrespected. And the idea that I could dismantle her empire using the same paperwork she'd been hiding behind filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long, long time. And as I walked back home that evening, Merrick promised to introduce me to a few other residents who were equally fed up, including a former accountant who had suspicions about HOA fund mismanagement. Kill Sam as yee. And by the time I reached my porch, I already had a notebook full of action items. Track down Meridian's legal representative, draft a preliminary purchase inquiry, collect testimonials from other residents, file a formal request for HOA financial transparency, and perhaps most important, keep all of this under wraps until the timing was right. Because Karen may have thought she ran this neighborhood, but I had just discovered the cracks in her castle walls, and I was about to walk through them armed with everything she never expected. Money, motive, and a memory sharp enough to remember every rule she broke. And as I watched the sun set over that peaceful lake, the same lake she tried to claim as her own, I smiled for the first time in weeks, not just because of what was coming, but because I finally felt like myself again and I was done playing nice. Just a few days after my talk with Merrick, I contacted my old legal team from my venture capital days, people who had helped me close multi-million-dollar startup deals without blinking, and I gave them one clear mission: find out how to buy the lake from Meridian Development, no matter the cost. And to my satisfaction, they called back in less than 48 hours with exactly the news I was hoping for. Merrick had been spot on. Meridian was in financial trouble and looking to quietly sell off several assets. And yes, the lake was on that list. And without hesitation, I told them to proceed with negotiations immediately. Because what was a few $1 million when it meant taking back control from a power-drunk HOA president who had mistaken intimidation for leadership? And with every legal form signed, every document notarized, I felt the power shift begin, slow at first, like a change in the wind, but building with each passing day as I kept my actions secret, playing the part of the quiet. A fined resident while quietly moving the chess pieces that would checkmate Karen before she even knew a game had begun. And during those weeks of waiting for the deal to finalize, Karen kept doubling down, sending me new violation letters for ridiculous infractions like improper mailbox paint or unapproved patio furniture. and I smiled at each one as I dropped them in a drawer, letting her bury herself deeper in arrogance while I prepared to turn the entire neighborhood upside down. And finally, the day came. The deal closed. The property was mine, and I now legally owned the lake and the strip of land around it, which meant I had the final say in how it was used, who had access, and what rules applied. And I decided to let her find out the same way she liked to surprise everyone else. In public, without warning. So I called for a community meeting using the same email system the HOA used. And I invited every homeowner to gather at the lakeside gazebo one sunny Saturday morning for a special announcement regarding the future of the lake. And word spread fast, because curiosity beats fear every time. And by the time the meeting began, more than 100 people had shown up, folding chairs filled, neighbors whispering. And Karen arrived fashionably late, in her usual designer athletic wear, holding her tablet like a sword and flashing tight smiles as she worked the crowd, clearly thinking I was about to be publicly embarrassed or scolded into silence. And I let her believe that right up until I stepped forward, cleared my throat, and held up a single sheet of paper. The new deed, in my name, notarized and sealed, declaring that I, Remy Thorncraft, was now the sole legal owner of the lake and the surrounding access paths. And for a moment, the entire crowd went still, stunned into silence, while Karen's face drained of colour, her mouth opening as if to object, but no words coming out. And then I spoke, calm, clear, and with purpose, as I told the residents that effective immediately, fishing was not only allowed, but encouraged, that the unfair fines issued under Karen's leadership regarding lake use were revoked, and that moving forward, any changes to lake policies would be decided only through full community vote with complete transparency. And the reaction was immediate. Cheers erupted, people clapped, some stood, and one elderly couple even hugged each other. And in the middle of it all, Karen spun on her heel and stormed off, not even trying to argue, because she knew the law was no longer on her side. And in that moment, the lake transformed from a symbol of control and exclusion to a symbol of freedom, of standing up to those who abuse small amounts of power. And later that evening, with the sun setting behind us and the water glistening like it had been waiting for us to come back, I stood on the dock with my daughter, handed her a fishing pole, and we cast our lines together for the first time since that awful morning weeks ago. And for the first time since Rachel's passing, I saw a genuine, peaceful smile on Selen's face, one that wasn't forced or hiding pain. And as we sat there in silence, just a father and his daughter reconnecting over shared memories and the gentle rhythm of the lake, I realized it was never about winning or revenge. It was about creating a space where healing could happen without fear, where neighbors looked out for each other instead of living in fear of arbitrary rules. And though Karen may have lost her grip on the lake, what really ended that day was the silent reign of fear she held over an entire community. And I didn't just buy a piece of water. I reclaimed something far more valuable: the right to peace, the right to memory, the right to live without being punished for being human. And as the stars came out one by one, and my daughter leaned her head against my shoulder, I finally felt like I had come home, not just to a house in Lakeside Estates, but to a place where we could start again, stronger, free, and finally at peace. If you believe one voice can stand up to injustice and that quiet courage can change an entire community, then don't just watch, be part of it. Hit that like button if you've ever had to fight for what's right. Subscribe for more real stories of ordinary people making extraordinary moves. And drop a comment below. What would you have done if the HOA came after your family? Let's talk.